Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast with Pastor Bruce Frank. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. We are in the middle of our One at a Time series right now, where every week in our church, we're going through the gospel accounts and looking at how Jesus, he did minister to the crowds, but he often zoomed in and he focused in on the individual and had awesome life-changing conversations with individual people. And we're going to be looking at those stories throughout the Bible all summer long. So as we do that today, quick introductions. I'm here again with Pastor Bruce Frank, our lead pastor. My name's Christian. I serve on staff here. And we're going to have an awesome conversation about the passage that you preached last Sunday, John chapter 8. Yeah. But first, wanted to kind of give you some space to share with people listening, watching, people of our church, 2 questions. Yeah. First of all, would love to hear maybe what you're seeing God do in our church right now, just from your seat, what's standing out. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and we're blessed right now. This has been, in some ways, some of the most memorable and certainly rewarding first 4 or 5 months of the calendar year. And I think the theme of, when we started off, just people putting their one on the wall, I mean, there's 10 different benefits from that. Obviously, from praying to focusing in on sharing your faith, but also that constant reminder, the visual that is, helps us, remind ourselves about the mission that God has put us on. Yeah. And so it's been great to do that. And then the constant stories, and then people actually see, hey, I can play a role in this story, and they share their faith. They see their one come to Christ. Their faith is then built up. So there's so many benefits to that. So that's what I see God doing. It's just reminding us, is like, 100 years from now, what's going to matter? It's for the glory of God, to being about the mission of God. Yeah. And so our church has been that way for a long time, but this is sort of a particular, emphasis. And then even from that, kind of what it's a good reminder for all of us, because you can get so busy, and I'm super goal oriented. So it's easy to look at, numbers and goals and attaining and plans and strategy and all that stuff. And this just reminds me that, man, there's just everybody has a story. I mean, everybody we meet has a story. The ones that I'm praying for, man, what is it? And not that we have to know their entire story, and oftentimes you never will. Right. But it does remind you, whether it be the woman at the well, whether it be the woman caught in adultery, whether it be Nicodemus, whether it be, there's like story behind there. Yep. And so to look at people as people, not as, don't fall into that thing as they're not pawns, they're not projects, they're people. And people that are made in the image of God. So that's kind of the way I see a lot of the theme in our church, and me, and our staff. As you know, Christian, we spend the first part of weekly staff meetings talking about stories of God at work, and those have been just incredible. They're always incredible, but in this case, it's almost like another notch up. Yeah, I think we talked about it a couple podcasts ago, if I'm not mistaken, but just the natural bent, the natural flow of any organization, and really of us, of the Christian, if you don't fight against it, is to kind of grow inward and to protect us and ours and me and mine. And what, again, the one at a time whole, or the year of one, is all about, it's not just us and ours, it's them and theirs. And how do we look outward? How do we continue to focus on the mission, on the mission of God? Because again, whether it be Israel or the apostles or whoever, there's this bent toward inward. And that's why it's such a, you would think, you see the best evangelists statistically are the newest believers, which is confusing. It seems contradictory, but statistically it's true. That first year or two, those are the most evangelistic believers, as opposed to those of us that have walked with the Lord for a while. And so there's something there. I'm not sure all that it is, but for us, that's been helpful just as a church to jump out and get focused on the mission of God. Yeah.
Well, the world is so invested in project self, and that can kind of seep into where if all of your spiritual life is focused on you, it's also pretty exhausting. For sure. And one of the questions was, what about for me? And I was kind of mentioning that, I think, before the little break, was again, as a person who is kind of focused on real big picture. It's been super helpful for me, and not being naturally a super empathetic person. Usually, if I get in the flesh, it's about
all about the goals. It's all about the numbers. It's all about this. If I'm getting in the flesh, but what this has helped me remember, it's like it is a reminder that every person I see. Like last week when we talk. I know we're talking about it next week, but last week when we had that response time, if you want to be prayed over. People got some stuff.
Yeah.
People have some stuff. They always do, and it's been there. But that was such a visual. When you got 6 deep in the aisles of people responding and saying, "I need somebody to pray over me," and people were, and I love our church for 10 different reasons, but one of them is they're not content with playing church and acting like everything's awesome. And that was one of those probably top 10 memories, looking at just the outpouring of, the Spirit of God moving people to be prayed over. And so anyway, that's kind of all together what I see God doing in my life as well as in the life of our church.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, it's awesome stuff. Would love to kind of look back on last Sunday a little bit and talk a little bit more about John 8. Yeah. You mentioned in your message that there's just so many themes just in that 12 verses, loaded with themes. There's so many different things you could talk about, and you covered a lot of them really well. So I went overtime. Back in.
I found out I went overtime when they're like, the reason the traffic is backed up is because you went long. I was like, well, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I would say honestly, I felt the least prepared. I spent the same amount of time. As I do every week trying to get the message, but that one was, I don't know if it was just the ADD with some of the convention stuff or whatever, but it was like I felt the least prepared that I have in a long, long time. And as always, God is gracious and
he's gracious
and faithful. But yeah, John 8's one of those ones that, we dealt with the manuscript stuff on the front end, but the story, there's so many things that are similar to other stories. And yet at the same time, there's the twist at the end that you don't see specifically in the other ones, from the way Jesus dealt with, the people to both salvation and sanctification. There's so much stuff there that, again, that's the reason I went a little overtime.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to do it.
Sometimes you got to do it. I went short the week before, so it averages out, right?
It's all added up at the end of the year.
Exactly.
We'll go with that. So I want to dive into a few things that you mentioned in your message. Some of them were honestly kind of passing comments, and some of them you spent a little bit more time in. So obviously, the passage we're talking about, Jesus is confronted by religious leaders with the woman caught in adultery, and they're trying to trap Jesus and condemn the woman. And Jesus responds with truth and grace, like we talk about often. And eventually the accusers leave. Jesus shows mercy to the lady that's present there. But he interacts with both parties, right? He interacts with the religious people and the woman. One point that you made early in the message was that Jesus often ignored or just didn't even bother to deal with the religious leaders at times. Sometimes he did, other times he didn't.
Right.
I wanted to kind of dig into that and just ask, hey, what do you think that teaches us as we're interacting with people who may or may not be legalistic or people who are abusing scripture, things like that?
It probably teaches us a bunch of stuff. When you look at a Bible narrative, you always want to ask, who am I most like in the story? Who do I most want to be like in the story? Who do I most not want to be like? There's all those kind of things. So, when it comes, and it's just a brief deal. It's just the fact that Jesus, when they first are like, what do you say? Initially he just bends down and starts writing. He doesn't say anything. And so just that little, he didn't feel obligated to answer every single person. Now, Jesus could know what was in man. He knows, he knew what people were thinking. He knew their motives. He knew all that kind of stuff. And sometimes, we certainly cannot know that sometime. But I do think what it helps me is I don't have to answer everybody in regards to, whether it be X or, Twitter or whatever. You don't have to answer every single person. And so a lot of that will dovetail into Proverbs. There's 2 Proverbs that have always kind of helped me about when do you respond, and they're back to back, and they sound contradictory, but they're actually complementary, or at least but it's been super helpful for me. Is like, one of them is like, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be just like him. But then the other one says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. They're back to back. And so you're like, which one is it? Do you answer a fool or do you not answer a fool? Now, again, people are like, well, how do you know if the fool? Because listen, we can all play the fool. But the Bible does say a lot about what characteristics of that fool. So but when I put those 2 together, I'm like, answer it once with clarity and grace and precision. And anything more beyond that is simply a fool's errand. that you don't have to continue to. And that's been super helpful because, I mean, you know me, Christian, I want to win. I want to win the argument. I want to win the argument. I want to show you why. I want you to admit that you've lost the argument, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, you don't have to. You don't have to just... so that was just a little sidebar for me. Maybe it's just the season I'm in.
Yeah. No, you said it kind of and then moved on, and I was like, I want to dig into that a little bit more. So that's very helpful. The flip side of that is Jesus follows up, and he has this completely different interaction with the woman. And I think the verbiage you use is that he gets down on her level, and obviously he offers mercy. So question one, what does it teach us about the religious people? Question two is, hey, what does that teach us? Obviously, as we're trying to mimic Jesus and how he related to people, how does that teach us about how to relate to people like that?
I mean, it's great. I will say this. It did, one thing I didn't hit enough, I did it a little bit, but he doesn't condone what she was doing. I mean, he clearly calls sin. Sometimes people will, paint her as the victim, and maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. But either way, Jesus did have Saul knowing all what behind her. She was a victim in some cases, but she was also, he's like, go and sin no more. In other words, what you were doing, you were sinning. And so Jesus did show mercy. He showed enormous grace, but he didn't do that by substituting that for truth. I mean, it's the perfect, truth and grace. I'm not condoning it, but I'm not condemning you. Was kind of what we saw. But I do think there you don't get probably every aspect of what happened, because something happened to her when she says Lord, which is a strong word. It's not what the religious guys said. The religious people said, hey, you're a teacher, you're a rabbi, you're giving us information. We got a bunch of rabbis. We just don't like you. We're going to get you in trouble. But she's like, Lord, it's the Greek word, I think, kurios, which is the idea of owner, master. Old Testament would be Jehovah. I mean, there was a transformation that happened. That's why when Jesus said, I don't condemn you either, but go and sin no more. And that's always been helpful for us. It's like, identity changes, then activity changes. But to your question, what does it teach us about the religious leaders? And I think we can't just push them off, because anybody who takes them, they took the Bible real seriously. Yeah. And we take the Bible real seriously. So when we read a story like this, we need to be able to say, all right, that's a warning sign for us that somehow you can actually use the Bible as a club. But on the flip side, you and I are supposed to have a prophetic voice into each other. We're supposed to, if we see something, I mean, biblical love, it's not blowing, like if you see a friend that's about to flush his marriage down the toilet, it's not loving to ignore that. Right. And so that's why you have a lot of principles from Galatians 6, to, about restore one another, but do so in a spirit of gentleness. You got a lot of different principles you can bring in there, but it certainly teaches us to Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about, where everybody says, he says, don't ever judge. Well, that's not what Matthew 7 says. Yeah. It says, take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your brother's eyes. Then if you do that in that order, then you'll be actually able to judge wisely or judge rightly. So all that being said, there's so much stuff, and people immediately put it into culture. In other words, how do we do that? And there's nothing, people have different roles on how do you speak into culture, what's effective. You got culture warriors on one side, you got culture engagers, you got all this kind of stuff out there. And that's a matter of wisdom, I think. Yeah. How much especially as a preacher, how much do you speak into the culture? If that's all you do, if you just hammer on the culture, then to me, that actually doesn't take a lot of courage. It doesn't take a lot of courage, because that's not who's sitting in front of you. Yep. I mean, you're preaching to the choir at that point. My job is I've always thought you disciple the people in the room. Now, is there a time for you to be John the Baptist? And it's like, listen, you are wrong, Herod. There is a time for that. And some people have that role more so than others. But as always, whether it be the culture, whether it be whatever, I think the danger sign is when you look there and you're more enraged at the cultural sin than you are embarrassed of our own sin. And people, sometimes that takes people off. And that's okay. Yeah. But you need to have a scriptural back for that. Yeah. I've always been intrigued by Paul telling Timothy that he was the foremost of sinners. I mean, he's like, it's not that he doesn't say it in the past tense. He says it in the present tense. He says, I'm the foremost of sinners. In other words, there was that sense, and nobody would say he wasn't bold, but there was a sense of humility about the grace he'd been shown that then actually gave him the ability to speak boldly. To me, hammering on the culture, some preachers, that's all they love to do, hammer on the culture. That doesn't take a lot of courage again. Your people will pat you on the back and say, way to go, get those bad people. As I said yesterday, the terrifying thing is not that God judges the wicked. That's not terrifying. We would expect God to judge the wicked, but the Bible without Christ says, we are the wicked. We are the wicked. And I think that sense of humility we see in the book of Acts, that's what you want to have. So long answer to a short question. But that teaches us about, as religious leaders, that can be our bent, heartless. They obviously were using the woman as a pawn. That to me is probably what would be a good definition or description of spiritual abuse, just using people for, a means to your end. Their end was to test Jesus and get him out of commission. And they were going to use her, not because they loved the holiness of God. They did this because clearly John's commentaries, they did this to test Jesus. And so that would be spiritual abuse, I think, right there. Using people, when a leader uses people for their own ends, that's kind of textbook.
I was thinking about it last night after hearing your message yesterday. You really don't drift into having a repentant heart or consistently confessing or looking in the mirror. It's not going to happen by accident. And that's where that effort comes in that you talked about toward the end of the message is that requires something of you consistently, or you're just going to drift into self-righteousness. Well,
and it certainly it reminds us again, we always ground ourselves in the gospel. I mean, it was Keller that said it's not just the diving board, it's the whole pool. And that is it. When you see that keeps you grounded, it keeps you humble, it keeps you bold, it keeps you clear, it keeps you away from just moralism versus, gospel change. That's the beauty part of that story, I think. The verse 11 is the order is so crucial. It's like he changes her heart and then the behavior changes. And man, it's easy to get that mixed up. It is easy to get that mixed up. And depending on, how you are wired, again, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but I still have that bent. Especially early on, it's just like, I'm going to do enough stuff for God to be impressed. And when I do fail now, I still have that bent. Well, let me go preach a sermon or share my faith or memorize a scripture or whatever. Then again, I think it was actually, I heard it from Tyler. I think Tyler got it somewhere else because it's been around for a while, but I was doing the sermon reviews with those guys. And I'm like, I don't know where you got that phrase, but that's awesome. And I will use that. And I'm like, next time, put it up on the screen. And it's like, God is not opposed to effort. He's opposed to earning. And I'm sure that's, probably somebody like Luther or somebody. But the whole idea is he's not opposed to effort. Effort meaning, Luther did say, the Christian life is all about beginning again. Repent, let's begin again. Repent, let's begin again. And so when I saw that, I think it was Tyler Frank, I was like, all right, that's a great, you should have sat in that on your message about 2 months ago. But that's a great one. He's not opposed to effort, from it be worship, Bible study, all that stuff. I mean, it requires something to continue to have a fresh walk with the Lord. But you just don't want it to drift into earning, where it's like, I'm doing these things so God will not condemn me, so he'll be... No, you don't do that. It's like, listen, I'm redeemed, I'm reconciled, I'm all those things. And because of that, I want to spend time with God. I want to worship God. And that's the way change happens. Otherwise, it's usually short-lived. And when you talk about what John 8's about sexual sin, as I mentioned, there's more shame and defeat in that one area than any area. I've been doing this deal a long time. That it's accelerated. But it's always been like the one that brings the most shame and defeat. But without a doubt, in the last 20 years, maybe, it is accelerated to, the statistics, and it goes way down into the teenagers, and everybody's just so much. And so what happens is they just stay in bondage. You just stay in bondage to whatever, stay in bondage to that, whatever, the boyfriend, girlfriend, the porn, whatever that is, you never get free from it unless you understand, there's something so much more beautiful that you focus on, that your heart changes. You don't want that anymore versus like just grinning, I'm just going to hold on. I'm just going to be better. That'll last for like a week.
If that.
if that. And then you just kind of drift back to the like the dog returns to his vomit, you just return back there.
Yeah. 2 Corinthians talks about, Paul's talking about how basically the gospel, the glory of the gospel is so much greater than the glory of the law, that once you kind of gaze on that and you fixate on that, that kind of thinking, the self-righteousness, that I got to earn my way, I got to by willpower alone stop this addiction, you realize how quickly, that's not going to work.
No, it's true. And you crash and burn enough times, you finally okay, you either quit trying or you go on to what is real Christian maturity, and that is heart change. You got to have a heart that actually needs to be changed, not just as a believer, my heart, and certainly it's up here, but up here, this is where if I got to get some gospel truth down here, and over time, then your heart changes. Yeah. So again, John 8 is, I know we dealt again with the manuscript stuff up front, but it is one of the most, I think I'd only preached on that one other time ever. And it was so good to revisit because, as you said at the start, so many themes. Grace, truth, religion, mercy, sex, politics, all that stuff is wrapped up in those 12 verses.
Yeah. So let me dive into something that you mentioned a minute ago, which is that theme of sexual sin and just how weighty that is. You did a great job of speaking clearly about this on Sunday, but I want to make sure we discuss it on here as well. Sure. In our world, our culture, that you talked about the last 20 years a minute ago, where things have shifted and changed, where, sometimes it's like there's almost no such thing as sexual sin if you're looking at our culture and kind of what collectively we've thought. So why is it such an important thing for the believer, and why is there so much shame and guilt attached?
As I mentioned yesterday, there is, all sin separates us from God, no matter what. All sin is forgivable by God. But you do see, particularly like Paul with the Corinthians, that sexual sin, it has different consequences. It has different ramifications. Part of it's just what the nature of what sex actually is. It's not just, if you just look at sex as like, animalistic in nature, just going, which is what our culture looks at, is like, listen, this is just for pleasure and, whatever, hook up, shack up, break up, repeat. Just do that. Then you're like, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? But we all know it's a big deal.
Yeah.
We all know it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Even the culture, deep down, they know it's so much bigger than that. There's something incredibly mysterious. Now, they don't go on to the next thing to say, listen, this is actually to be Ephesians 5 talks about how this is actually a picture, of the way that Jesus is unified to his church and the way it gets really in the weeds. But even the culture knows. I think that actually is in some ways the root of some of the pushback against, whether it be the pro-choice movement or whatever. It's like, don't tell us what to do with our bodies, that kind of thing. I think there's all that stuff is wrapped in there. But again, it's an amazing gift that God gave for a covenant relationship. And so, like anything, Satan wants to counterfeit that. And let me just counterfeit this great gift God gave, and let's counterfeit it. And it has been counterfeited like, it's unbelievable. And again, the last 20 years is just, I think you have a lot more anonymity or potential anonymity, because a lot of reason we don't do stuff because we don't want to get caught. It's kind of a guardrail. It's like, all right, I don't want to get caught. I don't want to get, whether it's like, there's times you want to go smack somebody in the jaw and you don't do it because you don't want to get arrested.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In the same way for, up until 20 years ago, there was more anonymity, but now, you can sit there, or a teenager can sit there. I've heard so much stuff about how, especially, the phones and all that stuff, it started like as a 14-year-old and mom and dad weren't home and it's baited for us now. Yeah. We got to admit, it's a different topic, but I'm like, all those videos that all of a sudden show up on your phone, those are those algorithms, all that stuff is meant to entrap. Yeah. And there's nothing that entraps you more than sexual sin. And because of that, think about it just pragmatically. If you're in a small group, people don't usually come out and say, hey, would you pray for me about this sexual sin? They do not do that. Yeah. That's like the one thing. It's like we can't talk about that. Yeah. And so anyway, it's a crazy time, for sure.
Yeah, but there's a lot of bondage there.
Yeah.
So the second half of that, which you talked about a little bit there, but want to really drill down into, is that, hey, obviously sexual sin, it's a big deal. It's damaging. It matters. But the gospel has the power to speak over that and speak into that. Maybe is that a good way to summarize that?
I mean, I just, when I was trying to think of because in some ways, sexual sin, particularly habitual, it's an idol. It's promising what the heart wants. It's promising whether that be security or, comfort, pleasure, all those, it's promising companionship, whatever it's promising all of that stuff. So in some ways it is the number one idol. I'd say, I'd take probably the number two idol. If number one idol is our finances and hey, that can make me feel a certain way by having a certain something, then close second, and maybe it's, maybe even reverse them, is pleasure and the easiest. And nowadays we can do it like, it's not only anonymous, but it's like, I don't even have to, I have to look at a person and basically say that person is, you can kind of like non-existent. That's just that's why I particularly like porn stuff, just as it changes your brain waves, because it actually releases a bunch of I think it's dopamine into your brain and all this stuff. And over time, I think, who did we have on a couple of months ago? Donna Gibbs. She was just talking about how all that stuff, it just rewires up here. And so that's why when they say addiction, it literally is an addiction, just like, it can become that at least. So anyway, it's a crazy time. And then you've got a part of our culture pushing that very, very hard, But the reason I think the gospel frees is the culture says you're an animal, just live like an animal. Yeah. And yet the gospel is like, not only are you made in the image of God, not only does God love you, but if you're a believer, and believers can get entrapped just as much, not just as much, but they do in a similar way. What the gospel does is, look, listen, you are not your sin. You are not your past. You are not your addiction. You are who God says you are. Right. And it starts coming from, all right, I live out of that versus trying to even live up to it. I'm living out of that. I'm living out. Think about guilt and shame and all that stuff. They can kind of push a little bit. You think about the military. I love the military, but think about the way they're not concerned with your heart, really. They're like you, and there's a reason for that. It's like you march this way, you do this exact thing. Your drill sergeant is going to get you to do it exactly this way. But unless he is in your face right there, you might or might not do it. They say the ones that have been in the military, you end up doing it for the love of the brother next to you. And that's what ends up being that deeper motivation. And for us, the deeper motivation is, I got a father who loves me, who wants the best for me. The part about sexual sin that sometimes is so diabolical is it can make you give up hope. And so people just kind of live in their shame. And that's a little bit unique regarding other sin. Other stuff like greed, we don't really kind of talk about, or we don't really do it. But other stuff like even divorce, even stuff like that, it's, of course, that's public, and it's like, hey, I need some help, or we get community, or grief, or any of those stuff. But with this one, it tends to kind of keep you down, because you don't want anybody to see you. You don't want your kids to look at you different, all that stuff. And so it's pretty diabolical. And the lies do come. I was reading this morning in John 8, or later on in John 8, it's like, listen, he's talking to the religious leaders, your father's the devil, and he speaks out of his native tongue, which is lying. And that's kind of where we get that little phrase when the thought comes into your mind, or it's like, keep this secret, don't get help, don't get community, don't confess, don't do any of that stuff. They'll rat you out, you'll lose your job, whatever that is. And so with all that, you're just like, okay, it's hard not to believe the lies.
Yeah, when they're coming at you like that, for sure. So last question as we wrap this up. We've circled this quite a bit, but this passage, like many in the Bible, should force us to look in the mirror and think about the way that we view and we judge sin in others, and the way that we repent of sin in ourselves. So if we're honest, I think the church can either be really great at this or really terrible at this. If we look back, not just today, but in history. So for the people listening, watching, how would you counsel people to strike that right balance when it comes to repentance and discerning judgment in the world around us?
That's talking about the way we see it in others, or the way we see it in ourselves.
I guess finding that order and balance in the right way.
Well, what you see here in the stories, you don't see Jesus condoning He does not, and that's clear. In all the mercy and grace that he shows, he's not condoning what she does. All right, he's not saying, hey, just whatever, go back to your adulterous ways. He clearly says, go and sin no more. You have been missing the mark of, in this case, of whatever led to her being in that situation. He's like, don't do that anymore. But he started off by saying, I don't condemn you. And so it's not condemnation on one hand, because she was, she became, it seems clear to me, she became a believer in Jesus by her, just those little bit of words that she said. There's a bunch of things in there. It's not our job to condemn, and we don't want to condone what God clearly does not condone. So you both, I think what you have is humility, and you also though have a backbone, and so we're some of you can talk to the society, but I think what we have to interact with more is people that are in our sphere that we know.
Yeah.
Just sitting there and hammering the nameless, faceless culture or media out there.
Yeah.
Again, I would just ask, what good does that? When's the last time that really changed something? I think what really does is the people that we have some proximity to.
Yeah.
And so I would say this: if you have biblical love, then if you see someone that you like in your small group that is clearly going down, not a gray issue. Not a gray issue, because like Romans 14 talks about these gray areas. We can have areas of disagreement, and even maybe there's a small things that you would consider. It says, I think Romans 14, somebody was asking me in between services, like he was asking, clear this up for me, because one of it says, to the person who thinks this is wrong and he does it anyway, that's sin. So he talked about that. Don't go against the conscience. And then he talked about the weaker brother. So I would say this: if somebody's in close proximity to you and you see somebody making going down the wrong path, even if it's not like a crucial juncture yet, the closer you are, the more you can speak into that. Doesn't mean you can't speak into everything prophetically, but bottom line is, I think it was Bonhoeffer that, and I kind of butchered the quote a little bit, but he does show a great progression in your Christian life. At first, you're grieved over your own sin, but then for a year or so, oftentimes, because you're so on fire for God oftentimes, and you're reading, but you have a lot more zeal than you do knowledge, it's very common to get very judgmental about other people in the church. You see hypocrisy, you see whatever, you see partial pictures, and that's a phase we go through. But then what you want to do is come out of that where you don't ignore that sin. And when you have the platform to speak into that sin, it's like, hey, brother, you're going down the wrong path. You're going to lose your family. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. That can be very appropriate. That's where Galatians 6 and those kind of things come in. But it's done. So Galatians 6 is a great one because it says, hey, make sure, because you could be tempted. So that's that humility. Yeah. But at the same time, you're going there, that you want the best for that person, because it says, do so in a spirit of gentleness.
Yeah.
So again, a lot of stuff there. I think when it comes to the culture, do what you need to change your culture. We're supposed to be for the benefit of the culture. In other words, hey, you don't just have your little Christianity section over here for 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yeah. It's supposed to inform all of your values, and whether that mean vote or whatever God has called you specifically to do in the cultural sphere, that's fine. I would just say, again, bold. And what you see in the apostles, they're super bold, but they're also humble. There's a deep sense of what Jesus has saved us from, but then there's a place to speak into the culture, but even more so to speak into our companions as well, the people that we do life with. It's not loving if I'm making stupid decisions, then it's about to cost me big time. I want somebody to speak up and say, hey, let's, like the 4 friends, let's get you to Jesus and get you well.
Yeah. Man, that is super helpful. Thanks for jumping on here and talking through. We could talk through John 8 for hours.
Yeah, and I think we did, we did one that talks about, I'm trying to think where we talked about this. Christ and culture was probably a deal. We talked about the gospel bookends. It's like, we want to have, clarity with truth. I can't remember. It's like clarity with truth, but also compassion. So it's kind of a both and.
Yeah.
But when I start to hate people, when I hear that kind of stuff, that's just a warning light.
Yeah.
It's a warning light. Doesn't mean you got to be soft and all this kind of stuff. It just means I want to love that person like I see that. I want to love them like Jesus loved them. So to answer the question in a big picture, when you look at a story like this, who do I not want to be? I don't want to be the rock throwers.
Yeah.
I need to probably understand I am, in the big picture, I'm the woman who needs grace and truth from Jesus. But who do you want to be? Who do you aspire to be? You aspire to be You want to be as close to Jesus in this situation as you can, which was Jesus showed, he did not pity fools, and especially obstinate, people that really bullied people. He did not. Yeah. I mean, you look at bullies, Jesus stood up to the bullies. Not that we're bullying him all the time. Yeah. But that we're bullying other people, like sheep. In this story. Yeah. I mean, I love that. It's like the great theologian, the American sniper. I just remember there's a scene in that movie, and I love that scene, where the dad of the American sniper, it's like, I think the boys had gotten in a fight or something. You remember the scene?
I don't know.
Okay, they're at the table, and this is before he's like the American sniper. He's a kid, and it's like his brother had gotten in a fight, but American sniper guy had like protected him. He's like, boys, 3 types of people in this world. You got the sheep, you got the wolves, and he goes, you better not be a wolf. Yeah. He said, and you got the sheepdog. He said, God's called y'all to be a sheepdog, because you kind of already see that protective instinct in there. And so I always think about that scene when Jesus, when you had the wolves, when you had the people trying to bully and people, and he stood up strong to those people, called them out.
That's what shepherds do.
That's what shepherds do. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Man, that was very helpful, Pastor. Thank you for jumping on here and taking some time today to keep talking about John 8.
That's good.
We're jumping back in this weekend. Series continues. Yep. And I cannot wait to hear just, again, we talked about what God did last weekend. He's doing it through our people every day and every weekend. So looking forward to that, and want to encourage everybody listening. Hope you are... hopefully this is a resource that helps you follow Jesus even closer in the days ahead. We're going to be back, obviously, Sunday, and we'll be back next Wednesday having another great conversation. Cannot wait to journey with you. Hopefully this has been an encouragement to you. As always, you are loved and sent.